I know there is a principle that says that the conversations in between papers at conferences are often as rich, to say the least, as the papers themselves, in which case these are really good conversations. But let's gather. Okay, so thank you all for coming back, and we have for about an hour, we have an opportunity to hear the emerging future of our discipline, which is just wonderful, and I'm very, very grateful to Michael and Serena and Elizabeth and Colin and Andreas for agreeing to be part of this panel. This is not scripted conversation. This is an opportunity to listen to each other, to hear people who are passionate about the research that they do, talking about what they do. You will see me from time to time check my phone. That is simply to try to ensure some rough equity in the way that time is shared out. Heaven forbid it's not impatience. In fact, my main concern is that we might get so animated that we'll keep on well beyond our time. I've allowed a little bit of recovery time in the schedule in the form of a longer break than we might otherwise need in mid-afternoon before we hear Professor Appold's paper. And we will hear Professor Appold, and then we will hear a few final reflections from me, but I will be mindful of the fact that I will stand between the group and the wine and cheese, which is an ungracious place to be if one goes on too long. So, I'm particularly grateful to all the panelists, and special thanks again to Bruce Gordon for enabling the presence of a number of the Yale scholarly community. And it's been a pleasure to be in correspondence with you and to meet you all for the first time. So let's, without more ado, go into it. The order that we will follow is that I'm going to ask Serena to talk about her work in religious communication in late medieval and early modern Europe. I will then ask Michael Hammett, who is a doctoral student writing up with me at Columbia, to talk about his research on the human-animal boundary and the theological dimensions of that. Then I will ask Andreas Berger to speak about his current research, which actually has two fascinating topics, one of which intersects beautifully with what we talked about this morning, insofar as you've been working on Christian Hebraism in Basel. And then I'll ask Colin to speak about your work on translation, which also merges beautifully into some of the themes that we were discussing this morning. It'll be fascinating to hear what you have to say. And then, Elizabeth, because you identify your home as being in the 17th century, I'm afraid you come last, but by no means least. And you also bring us into a very important place by talking about the relationship basically between theology and political theory through your research. So there are all kinds of fruitful relationships between the different subject matters that we'll be discussing. So, if I may, Serena, you're working on medieval sermon exemplar and their life stories in medieval and early modern Europe. Tell us about some of the things you found in your research and what you see as its major lessons.
Thank you. I want to express my gratitude for being included on this panel with so many amazing panelists, and also to be part of today's celebration. So thank you, Euan, for your work in organizing this, and I look forward to the conversation. So I work on, as was mentioned, religious communication in late medieval and early modern Europe. My dissertation explores the development of medieval sermon exempla into the early modern period. I'm interested in these sort of short stories that were incorporated into sermons but were collected as preachers' aids to serve as inductive proofs in the sermons, and which also became folk tales. So I was really excited to hear about this. I hadn't realized that the Luther devil inkpot story was a Grimm's fairy tale, because a lot of these sermon exempla also end up being collected by the Grimm brothers. I'm interested in that spirit of continuity and sort of the shaping and reshaping of tradition I'm interested in how both Protestants and Catholics are taking this tradition of medieval sermon exempla and sort of directing it in different ways, but also with overlapping goals. So my upcoming research over the next couple of years will be focusing on these, what sort of thematic continuities exist between medieval and early modern sermon exempla in terms of how do they describe confession, how do Protestants speak differently maybe about the sign of the cross or about invoking the Virgin Mary than Catholics do, and where do they rely on medieval sources and actually incorporate medieval stories into their own collections, sort of appropriating a medieval genre and identifying with it to a significant extent. So I'm interested in trying to bridge those traditional divides of periodization and confessional focus, and also interested in thinking about what stories shaped lay people's perceptions of the Reformation and of the theological ideas they had access to as applied to particular stories of particular lives, of events, and of wonders. So I would also be happy to talk about some of my methodological approaches. I've been working with some digital tools, including Transcribus's HTR, which is handwritten text recognition, and which can also be applied to printed sources that OCR is not as successful at transcribing automatically. So I'm happy to talk about that as well, and about sort of approaches to dealing with these large corpora that we have in the early modern period that, you know, no one's going to ever have time to hand transcribe 25,000 pages of these short story collections. So how can we have access to them? How can we search them? I'm interested in these sorts of questions and computer-based text analysis as well to try to identify some of those broader themes. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much indeed for that. And yes, some of us love technology and some of us admire it from a distance, but we all use it. That's great. Let me just ask, the question that immediately is going to come to mind from many Reformationists is one you must have addressed many times before. I thought typical Reformation sermons were exegetical or dogmatic. Obviously, they aren't only that, since you're discovering that. So what do you see as being the balance between the different types of homily, and what changes and what stays the same?
Yeah, this is a great question. I think I'll explore more of this as I look at more sermons from sort of different confessional perspectives, especially within Protestantism, where I think you see a real variety in that regard. But I'm really interested in these collections of sermon exempla that are used as preachers' aids and which are produced by both Catholics, especially Jesuit preachers, and Lutheran preachers, on the other hand. So I haven't found, if you know of any Reformed exempla collections, please do tell me. But I sort of am getting a sense that there might be sort of different confessional emphases in terms of how storytelling is brought into the sermon that maybe exist especially starkly between different Protestant groups, maybe even more starkly than between contemporary Catholic and Protestant groups.
Just as a quick thought on that, I was remembering Bruce's story this morning about the flatulent devil. I had actually come across that before, but I have a feeling it was in Johann Weyer's Praestigiis Daemonum. And there's quite a bit of this sort of preserving of semi-mythic anecdotes about Protestant figures, which transgresses the bounds of the sermon, but is nevertheless, it's present. There is a lore of these things. I know I've been skeptical about the continuity of lore from the Middle Ages to the early modern in certain contexts, but it is there. Any comments, questions from other members of the panel about this, about Serena's material? Or any questions from the larger community? Okay? Yes, go ahead.
So Grimm's fairy tales, a lot of the scholarship that's been done on exempla in the medieval and early modern period has been done by scholars of folktale and sort of folk culture. So they're while my emphasis is more on trying to understand the religious culture of the early modern period through the lens of these stories, there is a sort of rich tradition of scholarship that looks at the sort of transmission history of particular stories, maybe culminating in Grimm's fairy tales. So the idea isn't necessarily that Grimm's fairy tales were originally in Grimm and then incorporated into sermons, but instead that the Grimm brothers are tapping into sort of folk discourse that arose out of these sermon stories, that if you hear the same story over and over again, year after year, as an example in a sermon, then that will become an example that you then, as an ordinary person, might cite to your children or to your friends, or use to guide your own life and continue to circulate from in a lay voice, and then that sort of circles back into a scholarly mode when you have sort of folktale collectors looking for how those have, what stories ordinary people are telling to each other.
There is a theory that I've read that some of the most popular medieval folk tales of the supernatural actually start as sermon exemplar and then, so to speak, leak upwards culturally until they get found in the folklorists' collections. Thank you very much indeed, and we'll come back to those themes. Michael, I'd like to bring you in at this point, if I may. So, would you like to talk about your work and how the Reformation figures as an event in this much longer arc of what you're talking about?
Right. Well, first of all, thank you so much, Dr. Cameron, for inviting all of us to this panel, and as perhaps your last or close to last graduate student, thank you so much for being such a grateful, or gracious, wonderful advisor. I couldn't have asked for a better Dr. Fotter for my doctoral studies, and I'm grateful to be here with all of you today. So my research focuses on the idea of the boundary between people and non-people. And I say non-people because it doesn't just include animals in the created realm, but also includes monsters and humans that puzzle the boundary or push the boundary of what we would expect to be human, and expect to be in the created realm. And I kind of operated at the beginning of my research thinking this is probably going to be a fairly simple case of pushing that the perceptions of the boundary as static and firm were overstated, and it is simply a case in which the boundaries are far more fluid. But it is more complicated than that. And the question I sort of I've operated in thinking is, how is it that in the same realm within the 16th century, we can operate with theologians adamantly, vocally affirming the created order with humans at the top, animals below, and humans in charge of creation, at the same time that they affirm and encounter accounts of animals transgressing the boundary, or people crossing the boundary between people and animals. Or put in another way, how is it that at the beginning of the 1400s, we see rejections of accounts of lycanthropy or of werewolves coming out with the rejection being primarily theological, that this does not happen because it would challenge God's creative power over the world. And yet by the turn of the 16th into the 17th century, we get a rejection of lycanthropy accounts from a slightly more naturalist bent, that this simply doesn't happen because it's not possible. So my dissertation follows this idea of the boundary between people and non-people, and the ways in which, in the 16th century, especially Lutheran Reformation theologians on the continent in Germany, affirm and hold that there is a created order in which humans stand on top of the created order with animals beneath, and that never the two shall cross. And yet, as they consistently hint at in their writings, there are transgressions of that boundary that are viewed and that occur that they give permission to or allow to or view as something that can happen. Accounts of lycanthropy trials, accounts of monstrous births and afterbirths in the model of Philip Storgel, his work on monstrous infants, and even in the work of Paracelsus on natural fools and natural folly, i.e. those humans who are born without the capacity for reason. So the research that I look at is viewing how theologians in the 16th century shift their views on and address this sort of uneasy tension between a strict order of creation and transgressions of that order that occur regularly and that they are familiar with in and throughout folk culture, popular culture, and that pop up pretty normally. There are accounts in the work of Richard Evans on animal trials, of animals being tried as humans and being sort of viewed with a sort of moral culpability for offenses, and bestiaries, which ascribe an almost moral valence and character to animals beyond simply the mythical accounts of, or the accounts of them as fairy tales, but do seem to view them with a sort of moral characterological lens. So my research is viewing this sort of shift, this engaging with, I believe the technical term that Dr. Cameron and I have talked about is the muzziness of this idea throughout the 16th century, as we see the rise in more naturalist approaches to the world and the degree to which humans are then brought into the created realm and the created order, as opposed to simply being viewed atop the created order. So hearing Serena's work was very exciting for me when thinking about exemplar stories in sermons, because one of the ways that we learn about the views of animals in and throughout early modern culture is through exemplar stories that present accounts of animals and animal behavior as not simply being natural behavior, but also implying moral character. And we see this in bestiaries and in other folkloric tales, like Caesarius of Heisterbach's account of bees which make a tabernacle around a discarded element of the Eucharistic host. So my research is viewing this sort of tension between a static view of the created order and transgressions that imply a more fluid boundary. And so my research would view that, one, there is a tendency to hold to or affirm, at least rhetorically, a strong boundary between humans and non-humans. Two, despite their insistence that it is firm, they also allow for more fluid transgressions of that boundary from time to time. And three, by the end of the 16th century, some of that muzziness has been dispelled and dealt with to the point where we start to see a more firm boundary emerging in place of what was before an uneasy tension of these transgressions. And they start to make more sense of those transgressions. Thank you.
Thanks ever so much, Michael. And if I can try to draw, I hope not too stretched, an analogy between some of what we were discussing earlier and what you've just said. There is, as you've said, in the course of the 16th century, anatomy, zoology, botany, all of those disciplines evolve in certain ways. There is a critical spirit, a descriptive spirit. There's a clearer sense of what is in the world and what is just in the literature. Is there an intersection between that and the Reformation, or is this simply something that is happening as a result of quote-unquote proto-scientific thought? What do you think?
I think it's absolutely related to some of the developments in the Reformation, that as Reformation theologians are thinking and grappling with what it means to be human in relation to God's grace and thinking through the nature of the fall, theologians have to necessarily ask questions about where do animals fall and how do they participate in, or the extent to which they participate in the fall. And those questions about animals' participation in and the impact of sin on the animal realm raises those questions then of if they are falling, what was their moral status before? What do we make of animal behavior? And if we don't ascribe moral status to animals, then what do we make of behavior that would seem either beyond the pale in terms of beastliness, or what do we make of animal behavior that is then seems to imply a sort of moral valence? And I think especially as you get into the middle of the 16th century, as we see these Reformation-influenced physicians and proto-naturalists like Johannes Weyer, but also Konrad Gessner, who are dealing with preconceived notions of the animal realm, they start to transition into more natural descriptions of animals at the same time that they're also still inheriting a heritage that viewed animals not primarily in terms of natural description, but in terms of what signs and symbols they could impart to Christians and what they could impart to the theological realm. So there's a natural sort of interplay with the Reformation, and we see the theological questions about what the nature of humanity is and how humans fall in the created realm almost being passed along into and leaching into some of this proto-naturalist thought.
Thanks ever so much. Thank you. Any comments, questions, responses to? Yes, go ahead, Serena.
Yeah. Thank you so much. It's totally fascinating, and I cannot wait to talk with you more about this. And I love that you mentioned the Caesarius of Heisterbach bee story, because I just saw that when I was doing some research on an early 17th century Catholic exemplar collection. That same story is there. Anyway, we can talk about that more later. But bees obviously come up as one of these kinds of animals that's often put forward as, maybe our society should be more like their society, or we should be more like bees, or in the case of the bees who correctly worship the consecrated host, that's they're doing the right thing. We should be doing that too. What other animals sort of have stood out to you among the animals that you either should act like or you should try to avoid? Are there like sort of standout animals? Because obviously there's a lot of different kinds that they could choose from. Yeah.
The most obvious one that comes up is sort of there are two sort of cautionary tales. One is thinking about the serpent with the obvious connections to the creation narrative and the fall narrative, that serpents are deceptive and bring you in, but there's also the fox. And I'm not sure the degree to if this pops up in some of your exemplar sermons, but the notion of the fox as cunning, as clever but cunning and seeking to bring you apart from sort of Christian teaching pops up in a lot of bestiaries. And then when you get into some of the proto-naturalists, some of those descriptions still surface that interpret some of their ability to sneak and look for prey in this sort of moral lens. So I'm not sure what your experience are. I mean, you mentioned that you interact with Caesarius of Heisterbach, but I wonder what other examples come up in some of your exemplar sermons of animal behavior and the degree to which they express that sort of moral valence.
Yeah, I'll definitely be on the lookout for that. I saw Colin.
Sure, go ahead.
Yeah, sure. It's actually something I was asking you earlier, which was in thinking about like the Wunderkammer, where they're displaying these marvels of nature that they're encountering when they're exploring the New World in other places in Asia. I was wondering what happens to the relationship between man and animal whenever they display like an antiquity next to, say, a narwhal tusk or some mollusk that they found, right? Because I feel like in these Wunderkammers, you would often see a juxtaposition. You'd often see them juxtapose the nature of man, or something man has created, but also something God has created. So I was wondering if you could speak to that, if there's a relation between those.
Being mindful of time, I don't want to take time because I want to hear from everyone else as well, but absolutely. I mean, one of the things that comes up obviously in some of the monsters that form, which is a part of my own work, is looking at perceptions of monsters, is oftentimes describe monsters and monsteraries or skeletons of animals that simply haven't been discovered yet or haven't been identified yet, that we would easily identify as a narwhal or a giraffe or a large rhinoceros that are perceived as monsters that are somehow still in the created realm but are outside of that initial realm. But in terms of the themes of sort of exploration, yeah, I mean, that is a huge part as you start receiving travel logs coming back to Europe from the New World, from Asia, and other exotic locales. And it's not just these Wunderkammer, but it's also travel logs and written sort of accounts and people drawing pictures. And the degree to which they, people who are receiving these actually accept them as reflecting reality is hard to say, but they are accepting them, and it is infiltrating almost the ideological landscape of what is possible in the world, and it affects the theological, lineage too. That if you're trying to explain where do these creatures come from that are not clearly tied to the original created realm, they start asking questions about their lineage, and so they get into questions about, are they the son of Adam and Seth? Are they the son of Cain? And so lineages that are determined that help explain where some of these, creatures end up falling, I guess.
Thanks ever so much, and thank you both for your questions. And I'm mindful of time, and I want to hear everything from all of our panelists. Andreas, could I ask you to talk about your work? You have two fascinating projects that you described to me, and I think I'm going to leave it to you as to which one you'd like to prioritize at the moment. Okay. So please.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I'm also very honored to be here, to be part of this wonderful event. The reason why I have two projects is because I finished my PhD 2 years ago, and I'm currently finishing my book manuscript. But I'm also into my postdoc, and Switzerland, they want you to come up with something new, which I was lucky enough to have already. So my dissertation examines the shifting presences of Jews and Judaism in 16th century Basel, where there was no Jewish community, which is a lot of scholars have referred to early modern Basel as a city without Jews. And I look at the various forms of Jewish presences and argue basically that these early modern Basel basically just imagined Judaism and Jews hermeneutically, not like as real people or as a real culture or real religion. And within this hermeneutically imagination of Jews and Judaism, the Jews basically moves between presence and absence. It's always there, and then it's gone again. And to be honest, it doesn't add much to the history of Reformation. But there are a lot of overlaps in my book, especially on the chapters where I look at Pamphilus Gengenbach and his imagination of Judaism and Jews. And Pamphilus Gengenbach is very interesting because he was a very early protagonist of Reformed ideas. In his carnival plays, in his in his texts, he propagated all these Reformed ideas of reforming the church, reforming the state, lamenting the mercenary system, all these ideas that are very crucial to the later works of later when Zwingli and Luther came up. And interestingly enough, Pamphilus Gengenbach is a very important figure in early Reformation history, like Stephen Osman, whatever, had a very sharp focus on Johann Pamphilus Gengenbach and others like Eberlin von Günzburg that have somehow been, or that are very absent in recent scholarship, I think. So I guess there's some overlapping with my dissertation. My second project that I'm currently working on is, or that I'm writing about, is Hebrew epitaphs in Basel or in early 16th century scholarship. Sebastian Münster composed a Hebrew epitaph for Johann Froben in 1527, and then one for Oecolampadius in 31, and another one for Erasmus in 37. And interesting enough, the first epitaph for Froben was a near copy of Jewish epitaphs that he found in the city walls. In 1356, there was a huge earthquake in Basel, destroyed the city, and when they rebuilt the city walls, they used the Jewish headstones from the vandalized and destroyed cemetery. So by the beginning of the 16th century, scholars like Münster would study these inscriptions in the walls and use them for their, to develop their Hebrew skills. And his first epitaph for Froben was just a basic copy. The second one for Oecolampadius shows some development. He's still copying a few paragraphs, but there are also a lot of additions, like his own inventions. And then his last epitaph for Erasmus is a new invention. It's in Hebrew, but it's very in the style of Latin epitaphs and Greek epitaphs. So, but still with these references to Jewish epitaphs. So there's this development, like this typical humanist tradition, like this translation, imitation, and emulatio at the very end. That's very interesting because it shows some sort of like discovery of the aesthetics of Hebrew composition, of Hebrew style, but also a very early interest in Jewish realia, which has been documented for the 17th century, but not for the 16th century yet. We know of Wagenseil, who's been very interested in Jewish epitaphs in the 17th century. We know of these scholars who collected Jewish headstones. But that was mostly 17th century, so Basel was a very, very early, or is a very early example of scholars engaging with the Hebrew language, with Hebrew aesthetics, with Hebrew composition, but also with Jewish realia. And it was obviously because of this very proximity to these headstones. But it tells us a lot about like the idea of what Hebrew actually means, and this idea of like Hebrew more than just a tool for biblical help me out with the word.
Was wolltest du sagen?
Exegese. Exegese, thanks. And biblical studies, which I think is very interesting and illuminating.
Thank you very much indeed. I know there is a whole other fascinating project for your next book, which maybe we'll get time to get to that. But obviously, we've been talking quite a bit already today about Christian scholarship developing its grasp of various dimensions of Hebrew language, Hebrew texts and scholarship and so forth. The impression I form from your work is that even Münster, whom we think of as one of the best Christian Hebraists of his generation, was still kind of learning as he went along, so to speak. Is that the impression you're seeking to convey from these epitaphs?
I think so, yeah.
Yeah. Which in turn, I suppose, leads me to invite you to say more about what you feel about the place of the language, and because of the language also therefore the culture of ancient Israel as it is conceived in Reformed Christianity. Would you like to say more about how they understood, how, as far as you can tell, they understood the language as informing their identity as Christian scholars? Because I have to say the background to this is that I've had an impression, looking at the Reformed tradition from Switzerland, that the level of awareness of Hebrew Bible and of Hebrew scholarship and Hebrew language is more distinguished than almost anywhere else in Protestant Europe.
Well, in terms of like Swiss Reform history, I think it's part of the general humanist idea of like the classic language as a study of classic languages and the aesthetics. Just that Sebastian Münster not only turns to Latin and Greek, but also to Hebrew. He identifies himself as this humanist scholar in reinventing the present sort of with the ancient history in front of him, sort of. And Hebrews, the way he approached, or these scholars approached Hebrew is basically, I think, just the next logical step in humanist tradition, sort of. It's the same, they approach Hebrew the same way they approach Latin and Greek before. First you study it, you translate it, and you try to imitate it, and you try to be better at it than your idols were, sort of. Buxtorf, he famously claimed that he was better in Hebrew than many other Jewish people. That's why they thought he was Jewish, he claimed. Whereas we can tell, like we talked about earlier, some of these epitaphs, like the one from Konrad Pelikan for Zwingli, it's terrible Hebrew. Like everyone who looks at it is like, this is bad, this is terrible, which tells us that they were trying to become better. They were trying to be able to compose Hebrew the same way they compose Latin and Greek, but they were still in a very, very early stage. So we're far away from being mistaken for a Jewish or for a convert or something, because their Hebrew was still very, very basic, at least in terms of like applying it and generating it and producing it themselves. They were perfectly capable to read it, I guess.
No, you've anticipated the question I was going to ask, wasn't I? I thought a lot of that Christian Hebraism was pretty bad. So thank you for that. Yes, there is a degree of sort of cultural appropriation going on here, and it's intentional and it's conscious, with all the sort of concerns that we have about that. Yes, Kirsten, do you want to grab a microphone? I'll try not to fall flat on my face. Go ahead.
Thanks, that sounds really interesting. I look forward to reading your work. It sounds fascinating. I'm curious, I agree, obviously, a lot of what you read in early modernity is a bit rubbish, and it kind of makes you cringe a bit. One thing I've often wondered is, when I've read some of Hugh Broughton's Greek letters, which are written in Greek, one thing that really strikes me is that there he doesn't seem to be trying to imitate classical Greek, but the Greek of the Septuagint, because he believes that that is a kind of better form of Greek because it's close to the Greek of the New Testament. And he sees what he's doing as a kind of self-conscious rejecting of kind of a form of Greek, which he views as kind of pagan and in some ways kind of not proper. And that did make me wonder, and I've no idea, this is extremely speculative, so maybe the answer is just no, this isn't the case, if to some extent what's going on with the claims that people like Buxtorf make is actually a sense that they believe they are returning to, or kind of creating a purer form of Hebrew than contemporary Hebrew. And if there's actually, it's not just a sense of they're not as good as they think they are, although that is clearly an element, but if there's also an element of actually there's a kind of polemical edge to those sorts of statements, because they're judging their own Hebrew by a different standard from the standard of kind of what actually is good Hebrew. It also is something I wonder, because there's a sort of something also that people seem to say when the few Hebraists who come across Ottoman Hebrew seem to have a similar kind of approach, that this is not really what Hebrew should look like. But as I said, it's pure speculation, so I'd be curious to know what you think of that.
Thanks.
I think the challenge was that access to Hebrew was very limited still, especially when compared to these ideas of these classic Latin texts or Greek texts. In Basel during Sebastian Münster, all these scholars, they would travel to Augusta Raurica, which is this old ancient, the ruins of like this Roman city, and they would just excavate all these pillars and inscriptions, and they would like study them. But there was nothing similar in terms of like Hebrew realia or inscriptions just in Basel, in the city. That's where they had it. But this was the only source basically where they had, or that they had to get some sort of idea of what aesthetically or poetic Hebrew could look like outside of their biblical approach or studies whatsoever. And Wagenside, another scholar in 17th century, he sent like all these agents to, or he had like Jewish agents in Italy to go to these cemeteries and collect these inscriptions. So it's this it illustrates this idea that you need to collect these things first before you can actually study it, and then surpass it or become better at it. But it's a matter of like accessibility. Like, do you actually have access to the aesthetics that you think or that you want to study and that you want to imitate? Yes.
Thank you. Any other? Yes, go ahead.
Thank you for that. We enjoyed talking with you so much about this. And just on the train over here, we were talking about a truly terrible epigraph, probably one of the worst I've seen, and thus the hardest to translate, on Conrad Pelikan. And so one of the things, and you mentioned aestheticization, if they're so bad and you're like still learning, why publish them? Why attach them to a front of the book if they're a pedagogical tool? And what types of books? What does that get us? What's the hermeneutical value by putting it on?
I mean, the problem is when we say it's terrible, it's bad. The material I see is terrible, it's bad. We don't see the original. We just see the printed version of it, and we don't know about the resources of the printer and who actually put these letters together. But it's very interesting. It's very illuminating in how scholarly work in Hebraism worked, because these epitaphs, they were like reprinted and reprinted and reprinted again and again by by different people. There are epitaphs from the city walls in Basel. They made it all the way to England and Paris, and they were printed all around Europe. And it's this tradition of like studying the same thing, like again, the resource problem, like what kind of resources, like what the accessibility. So it tells us a lot about like the way they approached the whole their problems, sort of, and how these problems continued over time, because the errors are getting worse.
I feel like the medium is almost the message there. It's a kind of laying claim to that Israelite past, that Hebrew past. It's a memory thing too, right?
Oh, absolutely, and a polemically laying claim, of course. I mean, if you look at the sort of theologies of covenant and covenantal history, there's a very explicit Christians laying claim to the Hebrew past and believing that they are entitled to do so, and which is sort of very problematical to us nowadays in all kinds of ways. Here's a thought, you know. If you look at an early modern book, you will almost certainly have dedicatory poems at the beginning. And if you're like me, you'll almost always skip past them. And yet, clearly, at the time, people put a lot of effort into these poems, as it were, quasi-inscriptions, you know, verse celebrations of figures, which, you know, I wonder if someday someone who wanted to combine, as it were, Renaissance philology and cultural history and theology would be able actually to find out something quite interesting about the way that, you know, what was regarded as good in an early modern book, which made people strain every nerve to produce these pieces of celebratory inscription, which then get incorporated into book after book and edition after edition. But we'll see, that's just maybe that'll be done in 200 years, we'll see. Any other comments at this point, or shall we move on? Okay, I think we're just about on time. Sure. So I'd like to ask Colin to talk about his work in translation, which actually flows nicely from what we've been talking about.
Absolutely. I'll beat the dead horse and say thank you for everyone who made this possible. It's a pleasure to have young scholars speaking and be able to share their work, so I appreciate that very much. So my project is called The Mirror of Scripture, Translation and Memory in Translation and Memory in Early Modernity. I was thinking about the memory aspect that we just discussed there, about kind of laying claim to ancient Israel. And my project is basically a study of the relationship between the creation of new translations of the Bible throughout late medieval, all the way through early modernity, basically to the cusp of the Enlightenment, kind of where Jonathan Sheehan picks up. And what I'm doing is looking at some of the things we intimated earlier, which is the idea that each of these groups, which is laying claim to the biblical past, creates a version which speaks to that particular moment and answers questions of identity that they are asking anew. That's almost a banality to say that we each know that versions of the past exist simultaneously. But not a lot of people have grounded this in the actual texts, right? In actual Bibles that have come forth, and seeing in a comparative way how those stack up against one another. And so what my project does is it's basically a series of case studies that looks at what translation is to each of these particular Bibles, starting with late medieval Alsace, and I think I'm going to go all the way, like I said, to the cusp of Enlightenment with the Walton polyglot, which we discussed earlier. But obviously a lot of things happened between, say, 1450 and 1650. And what I've been thinking about and how I approach this is how the text itself, how the mise en page, how the illustrations, how the prefatory material, the dedications, all build these individual cultural memories, what Halbach would call cultural memories of the biblical past. And so much of the tumult of the Reformations is based upon these competing memories of the biblical past. And so I think if you stack them up against one another in these case studies, what you can also do, besides seeing the changes in memory and what, a reformation of memory, is you can ask whether or not there was a reformation of translation too. I think in the literature now we've gone from Reformation singular to Reformations plural, and lately we've been reforming things, ideas, and concepts, right? So the Reformation of the landscape, Alexander Walsham, or Peter Marshall's Reformation of religion itself. So I think I've been asking that question a lot in my research is, can we speak of a reformation of translation? What does it mean across time to work with ostensibly what's the most universal document of the period, and how it's articulated in these moments that meet particular needs? And what it also does is a case also for the eternal relevance of the Bible as a protean document, as a document that can continue to speak to us as we see how it's spoken to people in the past. So yeah, in practice, I've got a late medieval chapter, late medieval Alsace. I've got a chapter on the Renaissance translation of Jacques Lefebvre d'Étaples, who foundational biblical scholar and French translator who laid a lot of the groundwork for the early modern French Bible. I have a third chapter on the Zurich Bible, which discusses things that we talked about, the kind of appropriation of New Israel, the creation of this idea of the Swiss as an elect people, and how that is manifested in the Zurich Bibles. And like I said, I think I'm going to end probably with the Walcott Bible, which we've got at the Beinecke. And I'm going to look at how this accumulation of these biblical languages says something new about their foundation and says something new about the relationship between faith and reason, and on the cusp of the Enlightenment, how they're not set in such stark juxtaposition with each other, or stark contrast with each other, as we kind of led to believe with the grand narratives of the scientific revolution and Enlightenment. So it's a big sweeping project, it's a big ideas project, but I'm hoping to ground it particularly in individual manifestations, so we can concretely see how this works over time. But that's my spiel. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And are you focusing on particular texts and looking at them comparatively across different translations?
Yes, especially. So when each chapter is basically a language and a particular moment, but within those chapters, I discuss previous attempts to work in those languages. So for example, the German medieval Bible that I'm working on, I look at, for example, the transition from the Latin Paris Bible format into early vernacular German translations. So in each of the chapters, there is a kind of mini history of translation within the context of those changing ideas about what it means to lay claim to the biblical past. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. We're all aware, and just to sort of state the blindingly obvious, that the Reformation had the effect of making many phrases in translations contestable. Sure. The words that you use to translate a particular Greek or Hebrew word have a programmatic significance. Do you see that as having, as it were, a corrupting effect on translation, or does it make people think with more philological intensity about which is the more juste? I mean, what does it do?
Sure. I think that question speaks to the divide between what we think about as elite Bibles and popular Bibles, even though we've talked earlier about how there's not as strong a difference in those as one might think. in terms of how they circulated, right? Popular texts, popular editions like the Geneva Bible circulated through various segments of British society. So I think that there are, to your question, there are kind of elite scholarly Bibles that are created, but then there are also what we call not mass market for lack of a better word, that don't as much deal with that destabilization, and they're more concerned with domesticating, right? So there's a bit of a continuity from the late medieval through the early modern period. Despite the kind of rhetoric of the reformers of Ad Fontes, they still are dealing with the same issues that late medieval translators were dealing with in terms of how to domesticate this in ways that were effective. And so I see a fair amount of continuity there, despite what you're saying about the new idea of destabilizing what was maybe a more stable text in the Latin Vulgate with this new philological knowledge.
Okay, thank you. I mean, I think one of the things that we recognize about not the displacement, because it continued to be incredibly important even in the Protestant world, but the arrival of other texts beside the Vulgate and the recognition that the Vulgate was a translation and not scripture in its purest form, is that people start to get a sense of instability and how you work with instability, basically. Anyway, any comments, responses? Yes, Michael, go ahead.
Thank you. Your research sounds, utterly fascinating. I'm entrenched, and I just had a thought, because you're talking about translation especially, and you talked about this sort of reclamation of the image of sort of a biblical Israel, and I couldn't help but think of concepts of sort of self-fashioning and the use of both figures and ideas or places to stand in for own communities, and placement of that in a broader sort of narrative context of church history. So I'm thinking of someone like Fox's Acts and Monuments and his description of the greater arc of church history of being this loss of the true gospel that's then refound. And I'm wondering the degree to which your translations that you're working with figure into some of these projects of sort of self-fashioning, this rhetorical fashioning that puts the translation and also the translator in this broader arc of church history, I guess.
Thank you for that. It's a foundational question. It's really at the heart of it. I mean, self-fashioning is what they're doing with these paratexts. It's what they're doing with these prefaces, where they're defining who they are and who you are and other competing memories and pasts with what ostensibly is a universal document, right? So I think self-fashioning is at the heart of this. And I think, like I said earlier, so much of the tumult of the Reformation is these competing memories and competing identities jostling with one another and negotiating and laying claim to the same pasts, and negotiating and laying claims to different futures as well. But I mean, self-fashioning, it's an interesting interplay, because there's a personal aspect to self-fashioning, there's an individual aspect to it, but there's also the collective too. And I think I play with both of those in each chapter. For instance, the chapter on Lefebvre is about kind of memory of Lefebvre himself and why he's not as remembered in contemporary biblical culture, right? So he kind of falls through the cracks as a liminal figure. But then in the Zurich chapter, it's really about Zwingli and the Prophezei, trying to craft a vision of memory and identity for the whole Zurich church, right? A new foundation. And later, I think I'm going to handle Bullinger as well in his kind of refoundation of the church, trying to intersect with Bruce's work here. But yeah, I mean, I think I constantly have to negotiate that divide between the personal and what we'd call collective memory in the project. Thank you.
Thanks very much indeed. Right, I think we should move on to Elizabeth's work. We'll go beyond the even hour, don't worry, we'll give you good time. I think there's a fascinating connection here, because you're looking at topics of toleration, the second commandment, the forbidding of idolatry, and how that relates to Christian appropriation of Jewish principles. So you explain it much better than I can.
Thank you so much. As everyone has said, this is super exciting, and thank you to everyone. Right, so my big question is that I've been thinking about is, where's the line? And to clarify that, I mean, what is the limit of what can be tolerated and of what can be acceptable in a society? Because we tolerate things we don't necessarily like, but there's a line of what we will tolerate. And as we've talked about the primacy of the Bible, albeit in challenging ways and contradictory ways, in my project, I look at the Second Commandment and specifically the prohibition on idolatry, which itself is a complicated term, as that's the line. Because it is the simplest description, it is turning away from one accepted order and not just not believing it, but abandoning it for another. And it is a bad idea to sum up the entirety of the Hebrew Bible in one sentence, but I am going to do so anyway. And as I made this statement earlier today, it is Adonai is the God of Israel, and nothing else is, and you better get with the program, buddy. And I think that as we moved from it being talked about, it being idolatry or image worship in a theological church cult of saints sort of a thing, its ubiquity in the Hebrew Bible and in debates during the Reformation made it a shared language of acceptability, and that as we not only reformed our states, not only reformed churches, but reformed polities, it became the boundary for what I kind of view as the three basic political structures. The first one is the family, which I also don't think people take seriously enough as a political structure, by defining the bounds of adultery. The second is the state and defining the bounds of loyalty and treason. And the third is the international natural order, with defining the limits of rational religion, the rational believer versus the quote-unquote heathen. And I think you can really root both in the biblical commentaries, pamphlets, and the law itself, all those types of limits can go back to fairly explicit references to the second commandment. I understand there's numbers of the commandments are an issue, but the first or second one where they're like, don't worship another god and don't make any pictures, yo. So that's what I've been interested in. I also really am interested in, one, I think by looking at the Old Testament and the Hebraism, not just to like look at the idea of memory of an Israel past, but thinking about that the Reformation, as we think about it, and the developments that happened in the 16th and 17th century occur in a broader Europe where there are other people present, and both real and fictional, and that this is a process with everyone on a Christian continent, including Jews, including Muslims, and not necessarily just a phenomena that is Christian in itself. And then the other thing is, I was trained originally in, the very secular Cambridge School History of Political Thought, and I think biblical studies and the religious aspects of the Reformation need to be taken more seriously in these questions of authority, legitimacy, and toleration in political thought. And so that's my other kind of a big thing. Yeah, love idolatry, personally and professionally. So, yeah.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. Yes, well. Okay, This may be taking you way outside your comfort zone, and if so, I apologize, but there is a well-established medieval scholastic analysis of idolatry. Idolatry is a topic in the Summa Theologica and so forth. Do you find there to be continuities between those medieval analyses which were predicated on medieval Christianity and therefore would not have taken idolatry to imply the things that Reformed Protestants thought it did, and what's going on in the early modern?
No, that is a fantastic question, and it is actually part of the chapter I'm working on right now, which has been actually somewhat difficult because it goes initially outside my comfort zone temporally. What I find very interesting about the initial theological aspects of, iconoclasm or iconophilia is by the time you get to the Reformation, even in Luther and Calvin, their criticisms of saints, their criticisms of images, and the Catholic defenses of them are not that original. Starting in the Byzantine context, which is probably the biggest first wave of iconoclasm, where a lot of the doctrine was formulated beyond biblical patristic Luce stuff, with the Catholic official decision at the Council of Nicaea in the 700s. There were some failed councils before that, but that's the big one. A lot of the Aquinas upheld that, filtering through John of Damascus, a scholar that was used as a key, apologist for images by the Byzantines. And a lot of the Lollards, the Valdenses, thank you very much for those books, they've been super helpful, have also drawn on, very traditional ideas of what biblical religion should be. What I think is really interesting about the Reformation, and where I think the reformy bit comes, is through the process of looking at church images and day-to-day life, and I think this is where the continuities between the Hussites, the Lollards, the Valdenses, and many of the other dissenting sects becomes more prevalent, is the realization that these symbols and the destruction or preservation of them, have greater ties to other social orders. And partially, I think that's due to increased literacy, more books, histories of persecution of like the Lollards, spreading around with, Old Castle's Rebellion, other rebellions. And I think the period between the 1520s to the end of the Bildensturm in the Netherlands it's the quote-unquote politicization or, making that kind of, Clifford Geertz has a term that's really helpful, but I can't remember it right now. But enabling it to become something more through the process of destruction, preservation, and reading this big, spreading, contradictory Bible. They don't agree on what it is, but it becomes something, to use the technical term.
Thank you very much indeed. Yes, yes, okay, Kirsten, thank you so much. There we go, go ahead.
Thank you, I really look forward to hearing more about your work. It sounds fascinating. I was originally going to ask you for your opinion on Jonathan Wallace's book on the Reformation of the Decalogue, but actually now you said something at the end that is really interesting, which is about how your work critiques a kind of Skinnerian history of political thought, which I spent 2 years in Cambridge, so I have a lot of sympathy for anyone who wants to kind of critique that. But I'd be really curious to hear you expand upon how you think your dissertation in particular will sort of challenge it.
The first thing I wanted to say is that, I'll just quick note, the Jonathan Willis' Reformation of the Decalogue, it has won with all of the his work with sources and all forms of text has been so useful to like looking at a wide range of sources, some of which I wouldn't have normally thought of, especially as a quote-unquote intellectual historian. His study of text boards and putting the Ten Commandments up everywhere in churches. And he like has a huge list of everywhere they are in Britain, was super helpful to me. I find the book somewhat confusing as it's reordered the Ten Commandments in a way I wouldn't do it, but because I, Elizabeth, am God and think the Ten Commandments should be a specific way. But yeah, it's a super helpful book. I don't necessarily view myself as fully challenging the Cambridge School. I think, you know, I think it arose in a particular time and place, and I think it's questions of, you know, the traditional great books, political thought questions about legitimacy, authority, tyranny. Tyranny comes up a lot in Isaiah, actually, with idolatry, are really good questions, but I think in, you know, what the Reformation does, I think it raises a lot of very basic questions about, okay, what is a church? What is a state? What is a family? And to fully answer those questions, I don't think you can just like read John Locke by itself and do a very close reading. I think you need to read John Locke and do a very close reading, but then follow it in different ways. So my running joke is with Thomas Hobbes's Leviathan. It's 4 books, but you can't just read the first 2 books about the social contract and stop. In the second half, there's like 10 pages on idolatry and another 10 on the 10 Commandments. And if you go into JSTOR and type Hobbes idolatry, you get 1 hit and a footnote. And so it's like, I think the method is good, but I think it needs to be applied and integrated and reflected beyond the canon in which it is. And I think also, and I think this raises the question, you know, when we talk about cultural appropriation, and certainly if you expand it into a colonial context with Christian Hebraism in America and its effect on indigenous people, is the close readings of words and ideas in context do have real world effects on Christians, Protestant, Catholic, but also a whole other array of people. And I think, you know, if you go down that route, you have to expand not only in genre, but also in taking the quote-unquote speech act all the way into the action of policy.
Thanks ever so much. Yes, go ahead. Do you want to use the standing microphone behind you? Just behind you.
This way, the big boy up there.
The differentiation between the asceticism in medievalism, in which you have celibacy and the asceticism in the monastic tradition, but then in the Protestant tradition, you have the shift into what we're calling now procreational family values, in which we see the culture wars extremely operative in our culture now, between the procreational values, which then support the spirit of capitalism and the shift into vocation, whereas in the medievalism, the asceticism and monasticism of the celibacy was to support sacramentalism and the attitudes towards the body.
That's an interesting and complex question. I think one of the interesting things to me, and I had a conversation briefly about Tertullian and Tertullian's like basic quote on idolatry in his book, or not book, tract thing, what's a book, is on the subject is, idolatry is the most basic and most fundamental crime of the human race, and everything else is built upon that. Idolatry is the foundation for other crimes. It allows the potential for licentiousness and abuse of capital. It allows for the abandoning of, I mean, I think the celibacy issue is actually really interesting, because if you make an almost marital covenant with God, turning away from it is adultery. And indeed, if you read the book of Hosea, it is staggeringly profane. No wonder it's not really read in churches, and addresses those. And I think what's interesting is a lot of in some of the discussions of, clerical marriage that happen, the question is, well, if you don't let priests marry, you're trying to avoid adultery. You're trying to avoid other issues, but that you would come into. And I think there's a feminist aspect about the control of sexual politics that come from this, but I also think mostly it's a platform for other things. It's a platform for creating other forms of breakages, be it, coveting capital, be it demagogic politics in any time or place, or be it controlling sexual mores.
Thank you very much indeed. And I'm aware that we're slightly over our time, and we have a good bit of break before Professor Appel's paper. And I know that the conversations will continue. So I don't feel we're ending the panel. I feel we're simply, as it were, allowing it to flow naturally into the conversations. So, but can we express our thanks to all 5 panelists?
Thank you so much for your moderation.
So there are a few more drinks left if anybody feels the need of refreshment or just to step up and take a break.